Thank you. Hi, everyone. I can't hear you. Hi. Okay, at least you're not sleeping. So I'm going to do some checks in between because my presentation is very technical. So at any point, if you don't understand, if you're falling asleep, please raise your hand and tell me that I'm falling asleep. It's fine. I will not be offended. I will stop, we'll do something fun, and then we'll get back to it. This is not the best interactive presentation that you can find. But anyway, we'll take it as it goes. So, can I, is there a clicker or should I say, no, I mean, if it's not there, I'll just. It's okay, someone will update for you. हाँ ठीक है. Only it's a long presentation, but ठीक है. ठीक है. So today we're going to understand at least a little bit on the UN climate change process and a little bit of its history, what the process looks like, what are the different areas of engagement, and then finally we'll come to, as a young person, if you go to such a conference, if you go to a COP, what can you do, how can you be a part of it? So it's going to take about 75-ish minutes. I will try and pause in between for spaces where we can, you can ask questions and we can sort of take it slowly. But yeah, let's get started and we'll see how it goes. So anyone knows what is the full form of the UNFCCC? Yes. Framework Convention on Climate Change. Can someone say it loudly?
United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Thank you. So it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC. You'll hear this 15,000 times over the next 3 days because what we're trying to do here is to create, after the 3 days, create a policy outcome that can feed into a global youth policy statement, which will feed into these negotiations. Now, how that process happens, I'll come to that towards the end of the session. But this is the broad idea that what we're trying to do today is to feed into the UNFCCC process. So to do that, we need to understand what are the different areas, how can we be a part of it, and then understand what are the different changes that can happen. Oh yeah, lovely. Thank you. Then you're not bothered.
No. It's a PDF. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, that's fine. I have to point out. Cool. Okay. So a few things that we're going to look at. We're going to understand the history of international climate policy. So in general, where did that come from? We're going to understand the institutional framework under the UNFCCC, understand different stakeholders, understand what YOUNGO is, the youth constituency. You've probably heard the word a few times already, so understand what that is. And then how can you be a part of it? Next, please. So to understand the history, we need to go back a few decades, right? So starting right in 1972, so back then already there was conversations on environment. There was a meeting in Stockholm. If anyone has heard currently, in June there was a Stockholm plus 50. Anyone has heard about a Stockholm plus 50 which happened in June? A few people. So this is 50 years since the 1972 conference that happened in Stockholm. It was one of the first international conferences that spoke on different environmental aspects. And climate was not entirely known as climate change, but it was part of the conference in some manner. And then, of course, there have been some commissions, some reports that have come out after that. Then in 1988 was the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was made under the WMO and under UNEP. So UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization came together, created a scientific body which will basically collate scientific data from across the world, and this will be the official sort of science that then comes out, which is approved by governments. So this is, that's the IPCC that happened in 1988. And in 1989 was when global negotiations on climate, environment, so in 1989 there was a conference in Montreal in Canada which talked about, then we had the Montreal Protocol which came out in 1989. So that is the sort of history going back. All of that led to eventually, finally in Rio, in Brazil, the Rio Earth Summit. Now the Rio Earth Summit, which was in 1992, I think, anyone here who's heard about the Rio Earth Summit? A few people. Anyone who has no clue what the Rio Earth Summit is? It's fine if you don't know. That's why we're here, right? So the Rio Earth Summit was basically a space where they came to discuss different things on the planet, right? Discussing what different environmental issues were there, discussing how we can be a part of the solution. Already back in 1992, there were young people engaged in the process. There were young people who were calling for more change. Already the demands that you see today, back in 1992, surprisingly, same demands, that we need more action, we have knowledge, and we're not doing enough. Skip together 30 years, 2022, we're still making the same demands. So this is a sort of history of how, it's not that young people have not been a part of the process. Of course, they've been different, they've not been streamlined, there's different modes of engagement which came up later on, but youth have always been part of that engagement calling for change. So the big things that came out of the Rio Earth Summit were three different things that we'll come to. Next slide, please. So the big things that came out was one, there were three sort of commissions that, or three UN, which now turned into three different UN bodies, very interlinked, but focusing on different areas. The first one, which was in 1994, by the time it came into, was signed, it was in 1994, which was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the one we're going to focus on right now and over the next few days. There's another one, which is the UNCBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which talks about biological issues. The host is in Montreal, in Canada. And the third one, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So the UNFCCC and the UNCCD, the desertification, both are hosted. The secretariat is based in Bonn, in Germany. Next, please. So now, timeline of the UNFCCC, right? So we started from 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. We came ahead. There are a few different conventions. You don't need to note all of this down. This is just to get an idea what it looks like. So 1992, the UNFCCC was adopted. It was entered into force in 1994. Kyoto Protocol was one of the biggest protocols, the biggest sort of agreement, global agreement that came under the UNFCCC. Now we have the Paris Agreement. Anyone who's heard of the Paris Agreement? Okay, quite a few people. Anyone who's heard about the Kyoto Protocol? Not bad. So the Kyoto Protocol was the older version. There were two versions. There was then 8 years later was, as a second version of the Kyoto Protocol was redone. And then that ended at 2020, and the Paris Agreement basically from 2021, last year at COP26, was when we actually moved now into the phase of the Paris Agreement. So the Kyoto Protocol is now officially done and over with. So this is basically the Kyoto Protocol came into force. 2015, the Paris Agreement was negotiated, and then in 2018, and then it goes on until now 2022. Shrishti, next please. Next, so now talking about the UNFCCC, right? How do you make sense of what is happening? If you end up going to a conference, some of you have already been there, but if you end up going to such a conference, how do you figure your way around? What do you know what's happening? And how can you meaningfully be a part of it? So there are different bodies. So when you talk about the UN, when you talk about negotiations, the most common word that you hear is the COP. What is the full form of a COP? Any guesses? Conference of the Parties. But there are multiple other meetings that happen simultaneously under the banner of the COP. So the COP is the supreme decision-making body, and we'll come to that in a moment. But there are a whole different network of bodies that take place, which have negotiation items under them, which then sort of come under the supreme body, which is COP, and then finally the decision is adopted by the COP. So next. The supreme governing bodies, first of course is the COP, is the Conference of Parties. What does a party mean? A country. So it's a conference of the countries coming together. These parties are basically, they are party under the UNFCCC, which means they are party to the convention, and then they sign up, and then they can be party under the Paris Agreement or party under the Kyoto Protocol, and so on and so forth. So this is basically the space where everyone comes together. It happens every year in the winter. Of course, COVID was an exception, but it's usually an annual meeting. It happens every year at the end of the year, and there's a different host government that presides over the COP. So that means there's a different presidency. Each year there's a different presidency. Last year, COP26, UK was the presidency. This year it's Egypt. Next year it's going to be UAE. So there are different presidencies every year, and the role of the presidency is basically agenda setting. They look at what are the different items to sort of discuss where has the progress been so far, what do they want to achieve, which is why when a lot of people say, so COP23, for example, was hosted by Fiji, which is a small island in the Pacific. So everyone said, because this is hosted by Fiji, this is going to be a Pacific COP. which is basically a lot of focus on Pacific Island states, a lot of focus on how you can really be ambitious, because these countries are at the brunt of facing the impact of climate change. They're losing their land every single day. So the action-oriented approach was very different. Then we come to Poland, which has a very different approach, and then there was Chile, which was again an ocean scope, because Chile has a large coastline. So there are different kinds of agendas. This time they're saying it's an African COP because Egypt is part of the African mainland and sort of looking at different African perspectives. So each time you'll find a different narrative, as they say. Doesn't really change what happens, but it brings in a different flavor. It's like, when you're making dal, but when I make dal, I put a little bit of, tadka of something else. Somebody will put a little bit of sugar. Somebody will put, different kind of chili. So it's the same dal, but it's the different flavor that you bring to it is what the presidency does. It sends a different kind of agenda each time. So the next one is the CMP. Very long name. It's the Conference of the Parties to the Meeting of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So the P ends with protocol, so that's all you need to know. CMP is Kyoto Protocol. So any negotiations that happened which were concerning the Kyoto Protocol came under the CMP. All of the negotiating items, you would say CMP agenda item 1, CMP agenda item 15, whatever that is, right? So anything related to the Kyoto Protocol comes under the CMP. Next, please. Then there's the CMA. Again, very long name. Conference of the Parties to the Meeting of the Parties to the Paris Agreement. So here the A stands for agreement, not to confuse the P for Paris. So P is for protocol, A is for agreement. Any meetings under the Paris Agreement. So when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, there were 2 meetings constantly going on. There was a CMP, there were agenda items under the CMP. Back in 2015, when I went to my first COP, which was the Paris Agreement, there were different kinds of agendas. CMP agendas were at one side, so CMP negotiations. Then there are CMA agenda items, which basically, at that point there was also another ad hoc body, which was only there until 2018, which was basically to set up the Paris Agreement, which was the APA, the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement. So there were APA agenda items which were going on simultaneously, and then finally APA has now shifted to the CMA, which is finally the Paris Agreement. So now all the agenda items that you see at this COP, CMP has now concluded from the last COP, so from this COP will all be under the CMA. Next. So these are the supreme decision-making bodies. They're like the kings. They have big agendas, but they don't do the work. So who actually does the work? There has to be somebody else who does the work under these bodies. And as you see, some, they come and go. The CMP came in when the protocol was there. The CMA came in when the agreement is there. There was an APA. There were sort of other ad hoc bodies that came in. There has to be somebody who does the work full time. That is the subsidiary bodies. They are 2 permanent bodies that exist forever. They meet twice a year. So the COP, CMP, CMA all meet once a year in the winter. The subsidiary bodies, or the SBs in short, there's SBI and Substa, we'll come to that, but the subsidiary bodies meet twice a year every 6 months. They meet in the summer at the headquarters of the UNFCCC, which is in Bonn in Germany, and they meet in the winter when the COP happens simultaneously. So now, a lot of the times you'll hear negotiations, there are COPs and then there are also SBs. A lot of people go to the SBs, they engage in the SBs, try and work. So this is much smaller, less flashy, doesn't get as much media attention. This year I think got some media attention, but usually doesn't get any media attention, has about like 5,000 to 7,000 people. So very small, specifically for working. Very nice space to sort of first go and learn properly what's going to happen and how you should prepare yourself for COP. A COP, when you go in, has 30,000 people, overwhelms you just by the scale of the space, the venue, the people, the different things going on, and it can really feel like, okay, too much for me. So the subsidiary bodies are really the main core of where the work happens. If you want to influence a negotiation at COP27, you should have already been part of the SB that was taking place this year in June. In order to influence that SB, you should have been there at the previous session to understand what's going on. So it goes on, back and back. So it's very difficult to say, I'm going to go to COP and make a difference this year, if you've not understood how do you engage previously. So it takes a while to figure out what are the different meetings, how do you engage, what are the different levels of engagement under each of these sections. So the first one is the SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. Don't look at the screen. Any guesses what, just by the name, any guesses what this might be? Science, technology, very simple. So the SUBSTA is basically the body that liaises with the IPCC. All the science that comes in comes in via the substar. So it is like a door, right? You can't just walk into a space, you need to come in through the door. So if you need to bring in science related topics, they have to come in through a specific negotiation track. That negotiation track will fall under the substar. So it does a lot of stuff relating to science, relating to technology, relating to development and transfer of technology, all different kinds of things. Basically the more broader sort of technical aspect of the negotiations. Next. The next is the SBI, not State Bank for India, but it's the subsidiary body for implementation. As the name suggests, it works in implementation. So the substar does more technical stuff, SBI does implementation related stuff. So this is where it really comes under adaptation, mitigation, climate finance. What is really going to be, how is the implementation of these going to take place? All of that broadly comes under the SBI. And then the SBI and substar, they're best friends. They work together. You can't work separately under one and forget the other. They constantly work together. There's constant flow of information between the two. So the SBI and substar, when they meet twice a year, this is where the sort of negotiations happen, but this is also where the transfer of knowledge happens between. So together they discuss a few different things like the technology, sort of the technological aspect that was under the substar, how is that going to be implemented? The technology mechanism, the adaptation committee, which is, adaptation is under the SBI, but then what is the sort of backing behind that? So that comes under the substar. So there's a lot of overlap between the two. There's loss and damage. So all of the different more technical aspects then are done combined between the SBI and substar depending on what the sort of negotiation is looking like. Yeah, next. So you're not going to be able to read anything on this slide, and that's absolutely fine. It's just to show you how it sort of functions. So here you have the COP, CMP and the CMA, which is the supreme decision-making body. Then you have a bureau, which is the COP bureau. The COP bureau basically is it's a few individuals that come together from 5 different regional groups, and they support the COP president in different kind of decision-making. So it's a support body. There's the COP bureau. And then you have the subsidiary bodies. There's the substar and the SBI. Then there are different agenda items that happen under both. And then finally, they come together. So the decisions that are adopted or basically the decisions that come to conclusion under the SBI and the substar, they then feed in, go back into the COP or the CMP or the CMA, and then they are adopted here. So this is sort of the flow. It comes down this way. They do the work. It goes back here. And then this fellow says, okay, approved, and then it's approved. So very similar like a government bureaucracy. There's somebody at the top who says, okay, this is what we need to do. There's somebody under that working. All of that work is done. It needs to go back to the boss, gets the approval, and then it's done. That is the sort of circle that it takes. After this, we'll do one more. So exactly what I said, don't worry about all the different mess over here. The parties or the governments, basically, we'll come to that in just a bit, but the governments basically decide. The UN is an intergovernmental body. So these meetings are intergovernmental meetings, which means governments decide what happens here. So there are parties. Then there's the COP presidency. There's the COP, CME, CMP, CMA. There's the COP bureau that is supportive. The SBI and substar, so they give work to the both of them. It goes back as a feedback. The UNFCCC secretariat is basically the UNFCCC staff, which is the supporting role. And then there are different kinds of ad hoc groups. So this is the web of the UN, just to get some sort of understanding of how things link into each other. Let me just see what's next. Yeah. Okay, so we'll pause here. Until now, any questions? Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, like the COP and the CMA you told are the governing bodies, highest governing bodies, and they both take separate agendas, right? Is that so? And if they do, then how does UNFCCC streamline both these agendas? And then, because if you're having like different discussions, like you need to streamline it, right? So that was my query. Like how?
Yeah, sorry, I should have been more clear. So the COP does not make, so there are no negotiations under the COP. The COP is basically was put together when the UNFCCC secretariat happened. There were countries that signed the secretariat, they're parties to the convention. So they become, that is the COP. The parties to the convention are the parties to the COP. Under that, the countries that have now signed up and ratified, for example, the Paris Agreement are parties to the CMA. So the work now happens under the CMA. The COP is the supreme decision making body, will be there, but there are no different negotiating items that happen under the COP. It's a meeting of the COP. The CMA is the sort of body under which the negotiations happen. And then these are, of course, go through the SBI and the Substa, and then they feed back to the CMA and the COP, and then the decision is made at the closing of the COP. So a little bit of difference, but the work is basically done either under the CMA or the CMP, or in the future maybe a third new protocol.
मैं ये पूछना चाह रहा था कि जैसे डोनाल्ड ट्रंप ने पेरिस एग्रीमेंट से बाहर जाने का फैसला किया था, उसके बारे में अगर कॉप में कोई इफेक्ट पड़ता है और उसमें कॉप में क्या डिस्कशन होता है, बाकी की पार्टी उसमें क्या राय देती है और उनका कितना मतलब ये होता है कि डिसीजन मेकिंग में पावर उनकी होती है कि वो आगे जा सकते हैं या नहीं, क्योंकि अमेरिका इज़ अ बिग पावर एंड विदाउट लिविंग दैट पावर बिहाइंड, सो बाकी की पार्टी अगर एग्री होती है या नहीं होती है वो किस पर डिपेंड करता है?
Very interesting question. So going back, I said first countries, they signed up to the UNFCCC, they're party to the UNFCCC. Okay? That is one thing, you're a party to the UNFCCC. That does not automatically make you a party to any of the agreements under the UNFCCC. So countries have to sign up. When the Kyoto Protocol was made, countries had to sign up and ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The second amendment of the Kyoto Protocol, countries again had to do that process and ratify. There were countries which stepped out also of the Kyoto Protocol. Big countries, when, for example, the Kyoto Protocol was a little different than the Paris Agreement. The mechanism was more key, there is a pressure from the top. If you do not follow what you've said you will do, there could be, a fine or a legal action which could have been taken. But there was a timeline by which, you have to do this. So there were big countries, for example, like Canada, like aaj deadline hai, they have to finish, and now they know that Canada has not done what they've said they do. Before midnight, they've sent a letter to the executive secretary saying we are withdrawing from the protocol. So that is it, end of story. I don't have to pay any fine, I got out before the deadline was there. So I didn't do anything, I was there, I stalled progress. It's like this teammate, group project mein ek aadmi kuch karta nahi, aise baithta hai din bhar, and the last moment when you feel, okay, now all he has to do is print out and bring the presentation, sorry, he doesn't turn up that day. So this is what was sort of the dynamic, which is why Paris Agreement was a little different. They said, thoda sa we'll change it, keep it bottom up, and not put pressure on top. So it was a little different. But to answer your question, so when a country decides to walk out of the protocol or of the agreement, whatever, they can walk out. For the Paris Agreement, when Donald Trump said the US is going to move out, there was a waiting period of 4 years. And thankfully, this was exactly when it worked out really well for everyone. This cooling period of 4 years, which was because the Paris Agreement was signed in 2020, ratification in 2015, ratification was happening until the mid of 2016 when countries started ratifying, which means they started saying, acha theek hai, we are a party to the agreement. So for this to happen, there had to be a little bit of, there was a minimum number. It was, and I need to get my facts right here, but I think there was 55% of countries or 55% of the population of the world or something like this. There was a 55% category and they were lagging back by a certain percentage. And this was the day, the last final day when India submitted its ratification and said India is part of the protocol, of the agreement. And this is how the Paris Agreement was adopted, because India then filled in the gap that was required. So it's actually not many people really think about, because this is not something that's known, but the missing link for the Paris Agreement to really become a success was India signing up at the very last moment saying, okay, this is the day when we bring in and we sign up, we're a party to the agreement. So now once this is done, there was a cooling period where you cannot leave until 4 years, because this was 2020 when the Paris Agreement was going to be adopted. So the cooling period was you can only come out of the agreement before it is finally adopted, and that takes 4 years. Luckily for everyone, Donald Trump was not re-elected, and the date of his re-election, so if he would have been re-elected also, the date of his re-election and the date of the US signing out of the Paris Agreement, the US would have signed out of the Paris Agreement the next day after Donald Trump would have been re-elected, or now that Joe Biden was elected. So it just so happened that it fit exactly the number of days, and then Joe Biden came in and the first thing he did was, okay, we don't leave the Paris Agreement. The impact of that could have been two things. One, when we go into the negotiations, of course, different countries have different kinds of views, they have powers, they're talking on different things. There's a lot of geopolitical friendship, If I'm friends with someone, I will take her side on everything she says. I don't care what she's saying, my friend is saying it, I will take her side. Somebody is making sense, I'll be like, no, this is rubbish. Why? Because my friend said something different. Very simple. It's friendship that goes on there, which only works. So in such a situation, the US plays a very critical role in deciding which side of the fence to go because just of the economic power that the country has. It is an economic superpower. So it has a lot of strings that it can pull and say, you know, no, you will sort of do this, you will do that. So when that sort of loses away and it pulls some strings behind the scenes, when you're not sure what's happening, without a pressure, without the UN watching, nobody knows what that could have turned into. So it could have probably been easy without the US out, you know, nobody's really playing these games and the negotiations work. Or it could have been that there could have been a lot of behind the scenes lobbying, which, you know, a lot of countries would have said you would not get funding from the US, and then they would have to possibly take different decisions. So this is something that nobody knows because it did not play out. But the thing to notice is that the US, under the UN CBD convention, we spoke about 3 conventions at the start. The Biodiversity Convention, the US is not a party to the Biodiversity Convention. And the Biodiversity Conventions are very, very, very progressive. They move at a much faster scale. They don't go back and forth the way the climate change negotiations take. They don't take that long to make decisions. They're actually much more progressive than the climate change negotiations. And it is very often the same negotiators, the same people negotiate under the UNFCCC, the same people negotiate under the UNCBD. And they say that, we'd rather go to a CBD negotiation because it is so much faster there. This is also because US is not there. So it's very easy to make decisions. Nobody's really like being a big block in the middle of the road. So different kinds of things. Nobody knows how it would have turned out. Climate change is a very different space than the biodiversity space. It's a lot more political, a lot more money, a lot more media attention. So yeah, I think it's a good thing that they're still in. Yes.
Yeah. So my question was about how is a host country selected? I know that the process of selection happens at the end of, in between the negotiations itself, but there's not a lot of information that comes out with respect to why one country was rejected and all of that. And so if you could, because you have attended COPs, if you know what kind of politics goes in the selection of a host country. And also my second question was connected to this, that why do we see such a big discrepancy when in selection of the host from different regions? Because I once did an analysis out of, if we just consider the 25 COPs that have happened, 14 have happened in Europe. And the one that you mentioned, Fiji, it did not end up happening there. It happened in Bonn. The one that was supposed to happen in Chile, it did not happen, it happened in Spain. So and although the host has to be selected from different regions, so suppose now Fiji was not able to host, why did not they give at the next COP, why didn't they give a chance to the Pacific again? So what sort of system takes place at the negotiations?
Very interesting. A lot of this actually, I don't think I have the exact details behind this, but the broad generic thing is that the COP takes place every year in a different region. There are 6 broad regions under the UNFCCC, and every year it has to move from region to region. So that's generally been how it has been moving. If you look, so COP20 was in Lima, which was in Latin America. COP21 moved to Europe, it was in Paris. COP22 was actually Africa, it went to Morocco. So it's actually North Africa. So you see in the region, it's very close to Europe, but on the map, on the check boxes, it happened in Africa. COP23 was Fiji. Fiji did not have the capacity to host so many people coming in. They don't have the space, they don't have the money to host a COP. So they said, we can't do it. What could have happened was that somebody could have stepped in. Nobody stepped in, so the UNFCCC Secretariat stepped in, which is why it happened in Bonn, at the seat of the Secretariat. So Fiji was the presidency, but all the logistics, everything on the ground was done by the German government. COP24 went back to Europe. So it was supposed to be Eastern Europe. It could have been anywhere in Eastern Europe, but it happened in Poland, which is very close to Western Europe. COP25 was supposed to be Latin America, so Chile was the presidency. Unfortunately, 1 month before the COP, Chile had massive civil unrest. They had to drastically change, either they decide to just not do the COP, or somebody else takes up, and that's where Spain just happened to step in. I think they had good country relations. So that's just, it worked just organically. Within 1 month, Spain put together a COP of 25,000 people, which was quite a big task. And then 26, of course, is gone back to Western Europe. So on paper, and 27 now is again Africa, but it's again Egypt, which is very close to the European region. So on paper, they are moving from region to region. COP28 is in Asia next year, but it's in the UAE. So it's really not very Asian in that sense in terms of its location. So it does move, but the fact of the matter remains that it is the countries that have the money and the possibility, the means to host such a conference can do it. COPs cost billions and billions of dollars just in terms of finance, logistics, to put everything in place. And unfortunately, most of the world doesn't have the kind of money. Most of the developing world doesn't have the kind of resources or the space or the technology to put together such a big conference together. So that's somehow why it remains in that sort of central region. There's one question at the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Manini, and my question is regarding the Convention on Biodiversity and the point.
Can you bring the mic closer? Yeah.
Yes. So you mentioned that America not being a party to the Convention of Biodiversity is a bit problematic, right?
No, I think it's great. They're very happy that they're not there because they make progress very easily under the CBD.
So in my opinion, Convention on Biodiversity is something which is relevant in the context of developing nations more, which hold biodiversity resources. But since USA doesn't has any biodiversity resources, so it doesn't really matter whether America is a party to the Convention on Biodiversity or not. So USA quitting the UNFCCC framework and USA not being a party to the CBD, this is not a correct comparison to make.
Yeah.
So anything with respect to that which you would like
No,
to?
I think I absolutely agree, and thank you for pointing it out. I think I absolutely agree. They're both very different sort of points of view, very different approaches to both problems. The CBD focuses on a whole different outlook on biodiversity. UNFCCC surprisingly doesn't talk about biodiversity. The term biodiversity barely comes. It doesn't mention the Paris Agreement at all. So in a way, while they're very separate in terms of the thematics, they're also very interlinked in terms of actual work. You cannot work on climate without focusing on biodiversity, and similarly, you can't talk about biological or ecological damage without really thinking about climate change. Because ultimately, the environment doesn't know that, sorry, this is biodiversity, I will not affect the climate, or vice versa. So while in theory it does make sense that, it's fine if US is not under the CBD, and in fact, I think it's working progressively for the CBD. I have not been very involved in the CBD process. I'm very much on the sidelines. So there's not much insight that I can unfortunately give there. But while the US, at least from what I've heard from people in this space, they're more than happy because at least there's no big roadblocks that happen. So negotiations, if people want to decide and do something, one country is left out, but at least everyone else is doing it. Whereas if this was the case in the Paris Agreement, we don't know what behind the scenes would have happened, which nobody knows because it's not happened. The US is a party to the Paris Agreement. So nobody knows the kind of pull, whether it would have been positive or negative. It's all, you can make scenarios and, build castles in your head, but nobody knows what is going to happen. So like you said, very true. It's hard to distinguish and say, or to compare between the two, but at the end of the day, the processes through which the UN works is very similar. So just in terms of process matters, that's where sort of the comparison was, that without one party in, the process has been much smoother under one negotiation compared to the other. Yeah, I don't think it's countries putting pressure. I think there are a lot of different groups that are talking about like the different kinds of modes of approach of how Egypt deals with human rights, with gender, all of those different things. But I don't think, at least I haven't heard of any country forthrightly saying that Egypt should not be a presidency. And
Article 7 of the United Nations Framework Convention that is, that lays down the categorical structure of COP, ma'am, that basically throw a point blank range pertaining to conducting COPs. That the countries were absolutely independent in deciding what needs to be done regarding that. But you always know, there's a concept known as Matsya Nyaya which operates in international relations. Always eat smaller fish. That is going to happen. Who
yeah.
their own beams and fancy.
No, absolutely. I think finance and geopolitical issues are the underlying factor of the different UN.
Just in addition to it, while he was mentioning the article, when we're talking about this article, it clearly mentions it does not bring out the financial constraints into picture. It says that the COP can be organized like in a country which is feasible. So maybe why don't people look at different stakeholders? Maybe if India given an opportunity, maybe we can have sponsorships or stuff like that. So whether you do a research, whether you go anywhere, you will find that the nature is skewed. The world, absolutely, the pendulum always is towards the developed countries and they don't want to give us a chance. So I think when we're talking about UN being an international body, whether it may be UNFCCC, whether it may be UNEP or anything, they must have a system of check and balances. Because in this system of power and governance, we are the people who are sidelined. And when we're talking about environment or whether it may be talking about climate change, we are the people who are worst affected. So I think it should begin from us rather than going into the developed countries. So I think a proper system of check and balances must be important.
Absolutely. I think there's nothing more to say there. 100% agree. There is definitely a power dynamic. There's definitely an economic dynamic that's play at the UN very visibly. But India 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in 2019 had the UNCCD COP which took place in Delhi. So we've had other COPs. We've actually had a UNFCCC COP back in 1996, I think, was in Delhi. I can't remember. But one of the COPs have happened. It's just not happened not in the recent years, and that's true. Okay, let's move on. Okay. Next one. Yeah. So now, actually, this is a good segue in. So the biggest stakeholder, of course, are different. Well, let's do an overview. So there are broadly 4 main stakeholders. There are more than 4, but this is sort of just a broad category of how do you sort of put them into slots. First, of course, the biggest stakeholder, it's an intergovernmental negotiation. So they are the parties. So basically the countries, the delegates, the negotiators, all of the people who are an official negotiating access on a party badge. Then is of course the UNFCCC Secretariat. We've just had a very new executive secretary who was selected on the 15th of August. So his name is Simon Steele. Then there's a COP27 president, or basically president designate. In this case, he's till now the COP president is still the UK, is still the presidency. So Alok Sharma, who was the COP president, is still the president. He will finish his presidency the moment COP27 starts. So there's a transfer. That's where he will hand over the presidency to Egypt. So until then, he is president designate. So this is the president designate. This is Simon Steele, the UNFCCC executive secretary. That is me. And then, of course, there are observers. So observers are most of us. Most of us, we go to a COP. You're going to go as an observer, unless, of course, you're going to negotiate on behalf of your country. If you're going as a negotiator, you know very well you're going as a negotiator. There's going to be no discrepancy there. You know what your job is, you know your role, you've been trained to do it, and that's what you're going to do. And then most of us go in as observers who try different ways. There are lots of different things to do, and we'll come to that in a bit on what you can do as an observer. But you basically, as the name suggests, observe the negotiations, and then you try and influence the negotiations in various ways. So there are different types of observer constituencies, and we'll come again to the youth constituency towards the end, but there are different types of observer constituencies. There are broadly 9 different, you'll hear different kinds of names. You'll now hear the term constituency, you will hear the term CSO. CSO is a little bit more broad, civil society organizations. Civil society organizations are then part of different constituencies. You'll hear the term major group under different UN bodies. They call them major groups. UNFCCC call them constituencies, stakeholder groups, whatever. So there are 9 of them. The names can be a little funny. We're going to start one by one. There is business, which is bingos. Then there is researchers, so basically institutes, organizations, universities come under the Ringo constituency. There's farmers. There's trade unions, which is the Tungos. There's Women and Gender, or WGC. There's one for Indigenous Peoples, so the IPO. There's the Environmental NGOs, which is ENGO. There's local governments and municipal authorities. So local governments very different from national governments. National governments make decisions at a different level. How can local governments be a part of it? So they have their own constituency. And then there's Children and Youth, which is YOUNGO. So this is a sort of broad, sort of mandated 9 constituencies. They have official speaking slots. They have spaces to sit. They have representatives that they can send to different meetings. And they sort of have to be the cumulative voice for civil society in general. And now there are 3 more since 2016, 2017. There are a few more that are sort of in the midway's process of being recognized. Actually, there's a 4th one which I haven't mentioned here, which is still very new. There are faith-based organizations. There's education, communication, and outreach stakeholders, or ECOS, which is basically somehow come. It's been a mix of YOUNGO and ENGO, and a mix of a few like Ringos have come together and made ECOS. And then there are parliamentarians. Again, parliamentarians not necessarily doesn't mean national government. So how do parliamentarians play a group? So there's a whole play a role. So there's a whole group of parliamentarians that function. And there's a very newer one, which is for people with disabilities, and they're sort of advocating to have another constituency for specifically focusing on people with disabilities, their rights, their needs, their challenges, and sort of that kind of more diverse lens. So there are 4 different which are still in the sort of space for wanting to be constituencies in the, back and forth. It's going to take a long time until a constituency is approved. So this is a sort of broad, but these are the 9 official ones as of now, and then 3, and then there's disability, which I haven't put up here. Then, of course, the parties. Different parties function in different groups, so you don't have to worry about this very colorful little map here. But what you'll see is basically it's filled with names of countries, and I know it's not very visible, and that's fine. You'll see bigger names here like G77 in China, SIDS, ALBA, LDCs, LMDCs, BASIC, all kinds of stuff. So all of these countries, for example, they function individually, but they also function mainly as a group of nations. So 197 parties, which are a party to the UNFCCC, and 196 are a party to the Paris Agreement. Basically, they function in different ways. They, of course, can speak on behalf of themselves, but they mainly work in different groups. And these groupings then sort of look at how their sort of groupings are based on very different kinds of, priorities, all those kinds of things. There are new groupings sometimes that come up as well. But the broad big grouping, which is one of the most powerful groupings because it has 170 plus countries as part of it, is the G77 in China. It started as G77 and China, and now it's more than 100 plus, 120 I think, sorry, not 170, 120 plus countries that are part of G77 in China. The most powerful group just because of the sheer power in numbers, but also because most of the countries are all from the global south. Actually, all of them are from the global south. So they're all developing countries that are part of G77 in China. When G77 in China needs to make a position on any particular issue, the 100 plus countries part of that group first need to agree, come to consensus, and then say, okay, this is what we're going to say. So there's already a mini negotiation that happens in all of these groupings. The most complex one is the G77 in China, just because of the sheer numbers. And then these positions are then put forward, and then there'll be one representative from one of the countries that is selected who will be then making the intervention and sort of then, taking it forward from there. But when someone says, I speak on behalf of G77 in China, that holds a whole different kind of weightage when someone just says, I speak on behalf of India or whatever. So the comparison weightage is very different in that sort of statement. Then, of course, there are different kinds of groups, different kinds of sort of things. There's one which is the EIG, which is very interesting, very small group, very different mix of countries. There's South Korea, Mexico, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and Georgia. It's really these tiny countries which somehow didn't fit anywhere, and they found some sort of like common ground, and they call themselves the Environmental Integrity Group, the EIG. Very progressive group, makes lots of different, really interesting sort of interventions on certain topics when, it's a mix of Eastern Europe, it's a mix of like with Switzerland, with Latin America, with South Korea. It's a very mix that nobody could imagine, and they sort of just became a coalition. Then there's another very powerful group, which is somehow usually not taken very strongly, but another very powerful group, or the SIDS, or otherwise known as the AOCs, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States. So all the small islands that you see in the Pacific, the Caribbean, other small islands, basically across the world, the AOCs completely comprises of small islands. So not big island countries like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, but really small island nations which have a population of a few thousand people across. The most vulnerable group under the UNFCCC and the most progressive group that is there to make change, because they clearly understand they have not contributed to the problem. They are the ones facing the brunt, they are the ones losing their lives, their cultures, their lands, their countries. So one of the most progressive groups, and the interesting bit is going back to the Paris Agreement, the interesting bit is the 1.5 terminology which has come in the Paris Agreement is because of the push of the AOCs. The language was only to keep temperature rise well below 2 degrees centigrade. The AOCs strongly advocated for 1.5, and this is how then the IPCC was mandated, and then 3 years later the 1.5 degrees special report came out. This is how the term 1.5 was sort of brought in, and this is how now 1.5 gets importance. It would have completely been forgotten. We would only be talking about 2 degrees if it was not for the AOCs. Then of course there are like bigger groups. There's the African group, or the AGN, they call themselves the African Group of Negotiators, which is most of the African countries. There's the Arab group, there's the LMDCs, which is the like-minded developing countries. There's an ALBA group. So there are lots of different, there's Annex 1 basically, so this is the European Union. The European Union also, very interesting, negotiates as a bloc, but countries also negotiate individually. But most of the decisions under the EU are taken as an EU. So they don't necessarily, like for example, Germany will not take its own decision and then Italy does something else and then France does something else. They negotiate as a bloc, as the EU, and they only make decisions as the EU. So that is sort of the broad idea. I think this also needs to be updated a little bit, but this is just to get an idea that countries don't necessarily negotiate alone. They work under groupings, they work under different blocks, and it's the blocks that ultimately make those final negotiations. Okay, so now coming to COP, which is COP27 from this year. If you go to the website of COP27, you'll find different kinds of sort of schedules. This is the most common, like action calendar. What really happens at a COP, right? This is sort of the calendar set out of each day, the 2 weeks. And there are different thematic days that broadly sort of the presidency decides what day is what. There's an entire day for youth. I think it's called, now this time they've changed it, Science and Youth. Yeah, it was historically always called the Young and Future Generations Day. Then in UK, the government decided to call it Youth and Public Empowerment Day all of a sudden. And now this time it's Science and Youth. I think it's called Youth and Future Generations. Yeah, now they've got the term back, Future Generations, but it's not Young and Future, it's Youth and Future Generations. So different kinds of things. Basically, the negotiations have no correlation to what happens here. Sometimes they might, but not necessarily. But a lot of the other activities that happen at COPs are tried to sort of segregate into these kind of days, little like focus on certain different kinds of things. So if there's more youth-related focus, you'll see a lot of youth-related events, side events, activities, panels, all that happening on Youth Day. You'll find a lot, like this is on finance, this is on adaptation, agriculture, food systems, gender, age. So there's all different kinds of things that sort of very broadly just to have sort of a thematic focus on a day or two. Next. And then of course physically at the venue there are 2 different zones. So if you go to the next as well, so you can see both. There's a blue zone and then there's a green zone. What does this mean, right? What does this blue and green mean? The blue zone is basically the space where the negotiations happen. So sometimes they change the names, they call this a little differently. When Fiji was the presidency, they called it the Bond Zone and the Bula Zone. The Bond Zone was where negotiations happened, Bula Zone was more sort of the public-facing side. Usually it's the blue and the green zone. So the blue zone is where the negotiations happen, green zone is more the public-facing side of the events. Under the blue zone, there are all the negotiating items, all the meetings, the plenaries, opening, closing, all of that taking place there. In addition to that, there are lots of different events. There are side events, there are different sort of, all kinds of things. So there are different panels, different events, different meetings, there are different, it's sort of the more lively bit. There are pavilions for different countries, different organizations have pavilions, whole lot of things. There are events also happening at the pavilions. But the negotiations are also in the same zone. The idea was to ensure that everything happens, that people have a little bit of space of overlap. The idea was also that the negotiators can possibly see what else is going on. But in reality, nobody has the time. So people who are in the side event somehow, for some reason, probably have no clue what's happening in the negotiations. Negotiators are so busy from morning to night that they have no time to even step out and think about anything else. They don't even have time to eat. So it's different to find time for anything else. So it's usually, even though it's in the same physical space, the idea was for them, like people to come together to get a flavor of what civil society is doing, what different organizations are doing, and what's happening in the negotiations, but in theory it's still pretty isolated in its own brackets. And then is the green zone, which is the public facing site. So it's usually open, it's more for the sort of the host city, for people of the area to really come to learn. So this is, it's very, like, there's different kinds of stalls, there are booths, there are different sessions, panels, events, all of that going on in the green zone. That has no connection with the negotiations. It's a physically different venue as well. It's very close by, but it's a physically different venue as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. Any questions so far? Yes. Yeah, so the negotiations happen under the physical space is it's in the blue zone, and the blue zone has then different kinds of rooms where different kinds of things happen. So the negotiations happen in one area of that. There are different side events. So it is very possible. As a young person, for example, if you're going to a COP, you can of course attend a few side events, you can go to pavilions, walk around, but you can also walk into depending on what the negotiations, whether they're open, closed, all of that, depending on access. If the negotiation is open, you can also walk into the room, you can sit there and observe the negotiations if you're in the blue zone. So the access, basically the badge that people say, I want a badge to COP, that is the badge that you're looking for, a badge for the blue zone. The green zone is very free, it's very different, really doesn't correlate. I've been to 6 COPs, I've never been into the green zone, so I really don't know what happens in there. But basically there's a lot of activity that happens in the blue zone. It's very easy to forget that there are negotiations happening in the same area. And similarly, if people are only doing negotiations, it's very easy to forget there's something else happening. But it's also easy to have that sort of overlap and walk around. Okay, any more questions on this? Okay, doesn't look like it. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into detail on what's at stake at COP27 because Srijani is going to do exactly that over the next over the next hour or so. But the idea is, in general, when the Paris Agreement was made, of course, each article of the Paris Agreement focuses on a different topic. So each article has a different area, and then all of that sort of comes into the big picture of the Paris Agreement. There were different things which were being negotiated. So if the Paris Agreement was already done in 2015, what are we doing now? That is one of the simplest things, right? What are we still talking about if the Paris Agreement was negotiated 7 years ago? The simple thing is that the Paris Agreement is like a menu card. You have a menu card which says these are the different things that we want to do, or these are the different things that are at offer. What we needed to work on after that was the recipe book. How do you now make whatever you said that you will make? So the implementation of the Paris Agreement, or the rule book, or which is now known as the Glasgow Climate Pact, the name kept changing as it moved from one area to the other, is basically what we were negotiating on. This was ideally supposed to have completed in 2018 in Katowice. So in Poland, this was when it's supposed to have been completed. It was at that point known as the Paris Rule Book. When it was completed, part of it was still left incomplete, but majorly they completed the rule book. They called it the Katowice Rule Book. And then they thought they'll finish it in Madrid, which was an absolute disaster. COP went on for 2 additional days, went on until the Sunday, and they did not finish the main, basically the most contentious bit, which was on finance. And this is why COP26 had so much of attention, because this was the final bit of the rule book which was left incomplete, which they managed to piece together at some point towards the end, and is now known as the Glasgow Climate Pact. So the name has kept changing, but ultimately the Glasgow Climate Pact, or the Paris Rule Book, or the Katowice Rule Book, or the Paris Agreement Work Program, all of this really talks about the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So really, after the agreement is there, how are we going to take on and move? So with all of that said and done, with COP26, a lot of that was finished. A lot of the most contentious bits on sort of what is sort of market mechanisms going to look like, what is the finance going to look like. They're still incomplete bits, but majorly they've managed to at least wrap it down as much as they could. And now, because it moves into action, now this is the COP for action, the focus is on what is most important, which is adaptation and loss and damage, which is basically from the development perspectives, and I think Srijani is going to take that really well eventually. So I pause here and then get into youth engagement, but any questions so far? Okay, none. Super. Oh yes, tell me. an interesting question. I think for me, it took me a few years to actually understand what was going on, because when I went to my first COP, I had absolutely no training. I didn't know what I was expecting, so I literally walked in there like lost. So it took me a while to really figure out what was actually happening in this space. But I think mainly, the change is really in the urgency of things. Like, at least people are talking more about action. I'm not sure how much of that really translates into actual action on the ground, but there's definitely a lot more conversations, definitely a lot more sort of people realize now that because impacts are not just happening in the developing world, impacts are happening in developed world itself. They're really seeing economic losses now. Even though it's a lesser extent, they're seeing it physically firsthand. So that sort of urgency is slowly changing. But at the end of the day, we do have to realize that people who go there all have their own sort of, yes, the country has its own agenda, but the person also has their own agenda. There have been so many COPs that have gone into one of these COPs. I think this was maybe at some point in COP 23. I was having dinner with some people from the UNFCCC Secretariat, and they said in the negotiating item that they were sitting in, there was this one person from a country I cannot remember, and it's probably for the best, who came there. That was the one only negotiating item that he was supposed to do at that COP, and they were almost at the verge of finishing and wrapping that up, which meant that if that item was completed, of course it will not be opened again for the next COP. So now, since that was the only negotiating item that he was doing, he would probably not come back for the next COP. So he ensured that the progress was not made. He ensured that there was no consensus, because it's consensus based. So even if one party says, we're not okay with this, you have to pause. So until everyone is okay, unfortunately the decision is not made. So for that negotiating item, he ensured that it would not get completed, so that he would be there the next year at the next negotiation, and it was another vacation for him. So while it's also, when we talk about countries not doing enough, it's really individuals who have to realize that this is not just a job anymore, it's really lives that you're talking about. It's a whole different approach to the narrative, which is why when we say we need more young people in the system, it's because the urgency, the impact, the understanding, unfortunately, for generations to come has not changed. It is changing, not that it's not changing. But there are always people like this, which is why you need fresh blood in the system to really stir things up and say, this is not okay. It's really not okay to use this just as a job or as a vacation or to bring your wife and kids or whatever, It is a lot more that you need to do. It's people's lives and cultures that you're talking about that are at stake at such negotiations. So, anyway, very long response, but while there is progress, I think it also really depends on the individuals that are going there and what sort of their concern with the issue is. Yeah. It's a delegation. It's a mix of people. It really depends on the country, what they want to sort of send. There's always a high-level segment at the COP. So last year there was a World Leaders Summit. I think they're also going to try and do it this year for the first 2 days. And then usually the last week is known as the high-level segment, because a lot of the issues need wrapping up. So if there's been any stalling, if anything is not sort of wrapped up in the first week, this is where the pressure lies, right? Week 2, you have to finish it. So when decisions that cannot be made, you don't have time really to consult back with your ministry or whatever. A lot of the times ministers are quite present in the last week. At least the last few days you will find a lot of which is why it's also known as a high-level segment. Usually not so many heads of states, unless of course they're invited to, like the World Leaders Summit, of course heads of states were invited, so they were there. Quite likely might also happen this year. But it really depends from country to country. Very interesting, another sort of dynamic, I'm digressing, but so when we talk about delegations, right, each country has a different sort of, again, it's an economic cost of sending someone from your home, wherever that is, to wherever the COP is, in this case to Egypt, and really staying there for 2 weeks plus a few days, whatever. All of the costs involved in terms of flights, especially when it's government, they also have a per diem or a DSA. In the UN, it's called DSA. Different countries, they call it differently. But basically, the cost of living, like subsistence, just for food and sort of transport and other kinds of things that are given, it's usually a pretty substantial amount. So the cost per person to the country is pretty high in that case. And which also then translates into how many people the country can send to a COP, right? So if the country is rich, for example, like a US or a UK or Europe, of course, can send much larger delegations. When you talk about a Fiji or a Vanuatu or a Tuvalu or Sri Lanka or Maldives, they don't have the kind of financial backing to send 50 people to a negotiation. Also, which means that you need 50 people who are skilled, who understand the negotiations, which means you have to conduct trainings for these 50 people beforehand. So it's a whole sort of chain of costs which come in, and you can't just surprisingly just pick up somebody and say, okay, you know, we're going to have you on the negotiations from tomorrow, because that person is not going to be able to do anything. So it's a very interesting dynamic, which is why I think also these country groupings, they play a very vital role, because countries, for example, like the SIDS, the AOCs, they do not have, each country sends between 2 to 3 people. And that's not because they can fund 2 to 3, that's because they get grants for 2 to 3 people. They can't fund anyone from their own finance. So they get certain amount of grants from the UN, from different agencies, from different kinds of development banks, and they send X number of people from each country. Then they come together as a coalition. So currently next week the Pacific Islands are meeting. They have their training session for the entire week. It's a PSIDS, or the Pacific SIDS meeting, where that as a Pacific they're going to decide who negotiates on what the different kind of trainings, what their positions are. So all of this happens in the lead up to COP, which is why it's very interesting to really, people who can send multiple negotiations. For example, last year, because the COP was in the UK, I think the UK had like 800 people on their delegation. Not all of them were negotiating, but that just they have the financial power to bring 800 people across the country and like host them in Glasgow for so long. Of course, the negotiating team was much smaller, but it's just the sort of sheer number that, when someone walks into a room, the United States can take 120 people as part of the negotiations. India also gets grants. India funds a few people, but India also gets grants from UN agencies. So it's really the sort of, the sort of socio-economic, disparity starts right at the number of people that go in to what is then being negotiated, the pressure, the play, all of that. Sorry, very digressed from what I wanted to say. Yeah. 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 India has generally had a decent sized delegation. I think it's also because there are lots of different consultants that they bring on board. So lots of consultants that work with the different UN agencies, UNDP mainly, but other UN agencies that sort of come on board to negotiate, because they basically work through the consultancy with the ministry. So they basically do the work for the ministry. So India has a lot of different diverse sort of, so even though they don't possibly get grants, they're funded through various different sort of areas, and that's how they sort of have a relatively large delegation. In terms of approach to civil society, so for years actually I've sat and like chatted with a few people from the delegation. Some of them now I know like on first name basis. I've sat with them, they've said, oh, thoda sa chai nashta karenge. They've got bhujia from home and we'll sit and chat for 30 minutes. But at the moment you ask them something concrete, the moment you make any ask, and please don't put this anywhere, it somehow just never happens. The topic is changed and they're like, oh, we're very busy, we have to move. So they're very friendly to approach, to talk to. They're very happy to speak to civil society. They'll also tell you, oh my gosh, you're doing such amazing work. You should continue doing what you're doing. We need more of this in the country. The moment you make a single technical ask, something has come up and there's a meeting that they have to run into. I've been told at the last COP, so someone who've met like every single year now, you've seen me twice a year for almost 5 years. I think you should you know the kind of engagement that somebody would have in that sort of system. The first thing he asked me is, do you know what a party is? This is a very technical space. We work on Excel sheets, until late in the night, and we really don't have time. This is not for you. You should do grassroots engagement. We really need it. I was like, sure, thank you. I mean, my interaction with you is that's all I can have, because there's really nothing more I can say here when that's the sort of approach you have. So it depends. But I've probably also, I haven't met the entire delegation. So I'm sure there was somebody else who I spoke to. There was a lady this time, and she was actually very different, more open. Unfortunately, she wasn't at a very senior position, so couldn't take too much input, and I think she was also probably on a consultant position. She wasn't a government staff. So I think individuals also matter. Like the more older male people are much more harder to get through. They're very nice to chat with, but other than that, it's much more harder to get through. But again, at the end of the day, it really depends on the person's sort of attitude, what they want to listen to, and after they listen to you, what is the sort of role in really taking it in? Are they at the position where they can sort of take your inputs? If they're at a very junior position, sometimes they're very open. They're actually also pretty young, so they're more than happy to learn what's going on, listen to demands. But unfortunately, they just don't have the sort of decision-making power in the system. So it then gets sort of lost in the process at some point. Yes?
of like how can we actually engage and what the chain of action and which bodies, especially in India, are should like manufacturers like us reach out so that we can increase the ground action per se. I'll just give a small specific example for you to get a reference. I'm a manufacturer of heat reflective coatings. That means we can make buildings cooler 15 to 20 degrees and cities cooler 2 to 3 degrees. Now, if you want to do that, I'm still confused. Like local organizations are alright, but how do we engage the United Nations framework to get such actions on ground and build cities cooler and cleaner? So that's an action-based question I wanted to ask.
Very interesting. So the UN, the system, like I said right at the start, the UN is an intergovernmental body. It's the governments that decide. The UN has no decision-making power. The UN is basically like this venue. It brought all of us together. But it doesn't tell you what you can or cannot do. It can set the tone. It can help draft agendas. It does a lot of the work behind the scenes. It can sort of lead you to a certain direction. But if parties say no, or if they want to move in a different direction, there's nothing that the UN can do. So it's a very, it doesn't have any decision-making role. Especially the UNFCCC in this context has no decision-making role. It's the parties that decide. It's the parties that figure out how they want to work forward. And the UN is for all kinds of back support, admin, technical, all of that. Now in this process, there's not too much space for individuals per se or organizations or businesses and stuff like this to really influence the negotiations, and which is why when we will now come to this, which is focusing on youth engagement, but it's very similar. It's basically as a business, how do you engage in this space? So when I went through the different constituencies, the first one that I said was bingo, which is businesses. And they have, again, well, they're not government, but it's probably not also civil society, depending on what kind of organization it is. But anyway, business comes under the broader civil society sort of stakeholder list. And there are different ways of then sort of working with that constituency and sort of lobbying or trying to see how negotiations might work, or trying to see sort of how you can be a part of different things. But outside of that, unfortunately, it's very hard for the UN to say, okay, we're going to implement something which is going to help, cool cities, or we're going to implement something which says, we want a plastic ban. There are so many young people saying the UN should say we want to ban plastic. That's not how, unfortunately, just not how the UN works. The UN cannot say we want to ban plastic. And these negotiations are technical. They don't get into details like this. All of these minute details are left for countries to interpret and to see how you want to use it back at home, which is another sort of instrument called as the NDC, or the Nationally Determined, NDC, so Nationally Determined Contributions. So each country decides what they want to do. So how this translates back to a national level is what is up to each country to figure out. The UN just says, we need, for example, medication, this is what we need, finance, this is what we need, adaptation, this is what we want to get to. But there is no scope within the UN framework to bring in all of this, because otherwise it's just going to go beyond control. So, yeah. Anyone working on NDCs? UNICEF. No, but I mean, basically, there are lots of different ways. So there's an NDC, which is a national level instrument. And then in India, for example, it comes down in different ways. Each country, they're free to organize it. There is what was initially called as the NAPs, NAPCC, the National Action Plan on Climate Change. Then this comes down to the state level, which is the SAPCCs, the State Action Plan on Climate Change. So all of this then slowly sort of comes down. So there's again like a looping system, right? So the NDCs is sort of the broad thing. Then there's a national action plan, there's a state action plan, and then states decide how that sort of happens at the regional level. So there are different sort of like levels on how this is done. Unfortunately, also, if you go down to even, for example, the national government, but definitely like state governments, if they've not been exposed to the UN framework, which is 99% of the time, it's very hard for them to understand what they are doing, how that's contributing to sort of the bigger picture even within the national government. So there is a lot of education, capacity building that is required just to sort of demystify, for example, the word of the UN and how, from a national perspective, how are they contributing to that, which is required at all levels, right from like municipalities to gram panchayats to going up the list. But basically that's the sort of hierarchy. There's a national plan, then there's state plans, and then there are different, some are just ministries that take up certain different criteria. For example, the MNRE will look at most of the energy sort of related plans, transitioning to renewable energy, different kinds of solar, all of those kind of things. The MOEFCC looks at sort of the broader picture on ministry for on forest, environment, climate change. So it's its own complex sort of network, and I think it, again, I'm not 100% sure because I haven't been part of the Indian government system that deeply, but I mean there's different levels of how it sort of comes down to the state level and then the city level. No. So I think the case in point is that the state level, for example, they know exactly the issues that happen at, you know, at that local level. They know how to deal with it. Certain things which are very pertinent to a certain part of the state, for example, larger states also very diverse, you know, they deal with different things differently. So they have the knowledge in terms of what needs to be done. The knowledge that is lacking is just the translation of how does this link into the national plan? How does that plan affect us eventually? Like what is the loop, the cycle there? So that is what that sort of skill or like that sort of education is still lacking. Yes. Yeah. Okay, last and then we finish with this. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so moving to the final bit because we're already running over time. Youth engagement, right? We're here for a conference of youth. So youth engagement under the UNFCCC. The mandated mechanism to engage, like I said, under the civil society constituencies is YOUNGO. It's short for youth and non-governmental organizations. So it doesn't have a very special meaning, that's exactly what it is. And now we've sort of broadened it up for the past few years. It's also known as the Children and Youth Constituency, but it's officially still known as only youth and NGOs. This is in the Paris Agreement, where basically children is already mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So this is just sort of the history of how, like we've been in the process for a long time. So the history, and I'll run to this, you already know this, you can skip this. Just go back one slide. The only thing that I want to point out here is that, so 2009 was where sort of, 2009 was when youth was formally recognized as a constituency. So young people have been in the process for decades, but in 2009 they were formally recognized, saying, okay, this is going to be another official group. And then it took 2 years, so in 2011 was when finally the constituency was formed. So from the recognition to constituency, it took 2 more years. And 2011 was when YOUNGO was officially sort of named YOUNGO and given the sort of space. And that's the sort of linking into. So it's already been in play for more than 10 years now, and it's, as we move on, you'll see, the mission is, of course, it focuses on young people. It has 4 different, like broad is really an awareness, knowledge, capacity building. collaboration, cooperation network, policy, lobby, advocacy, and youth action. And this brings into the broader vision of that we want a climate positive society. We're living in harmony with the planet, where it's a generation of young people that are empowered, driving meaningful change. And finally, a UN where young people are sitting at the decision-making tables and are being taken seriously. Values and principles, I think that's fine. We can skip it. The thing about Yango, it is, so to start off with, Yango is not an organization. It is a mechanism, it is a process under the UNFCCC to engage with children and young people. So Yango is not registered anywhere, it doesn't have an office, it doesn't have a board, doesn't have any of that sort of things. It is a flat structure. It does have people who are elected, and I'll come to that position, but it is a flat structure, which means that there is not really, in theory, there's no really real hierarchy, so there's no one person who decides what can or cannot happen. We also follow the UN, fortunately or unfortunately, so we work on consensus. Every young person has an equal voice, so if you're a young person or whether a youth entity, you still have an equal voice. And it is the oldest and the largest constituency or youth constituency to any UN bodies. There are other UN bodies that also have the CBD, the CCD, UNEP all have their youth constituencies, but Yango is the oldest and the largest constituency under the UN system. So not going into detail, these are basically the 4 different things, kind of like broad focus areas, but the work is quite like overarching. Next please. Yeah. So one more. So these were basically looking at what Yango is structured and how it sort of works, right? So there's a big bubble. The big bubble is anyone who wants to join Yango is basically the individuals and organizations. So there's a very simple sign up form. You can just sign it up and you're then part of this bubble the moment you're in the mailing list. And then of course there's a little smaller bubble, which is the working groups. So all the work in the constituency happens in the working groups. And then there is a global coordination team, which is basically a team that coordinates, does all of the admin, the back-end work, and then there are 2 focal points. So the different working groups focus on different topics. There are more than 20 thematic working groups focusing on different areas. There are some listed here. So right from education to human rights to gender to science to agriculture to oceans, the list sort of goes on, and it's also not very difficult to start a new working group in case you feel there's still a gap somewhere. And then there are operational working groups like communications, policy, engagement, and the Conference of Youth, and you're part of one of that. Next, please. The individuals that are part of the network, basically 10,000 plus individuals and 1,000 plus youth-led organizations. They come from 170 different countries, so it is a global network. But of course, not everyone, not 10,000 people are every day, doing something for Yango. You're just basically part of the network. The moment you sign up, some people just are there for, just to see the emails, to get to know. Some people are more active. It's really free and it's volunteer-based, so it's up to you what your level of engagement would like to be. Yes, next. Then is the global coordination team. Hema here is part of the global coordination team, is a space that does all the admin back work. So selections of representatives, whatever you name it, I think everything is then done by the global coordination team, right from like admin to communications to steering of the policies, sort of outcomes, all of that. And then finally are the focal points. The focal points are elected at every COP. There are 2 focal points, one elected from the global north, one elected from the global south. So I was focal point, I was elected in 2019 at COP25, started the mandate in 2020. Usually would have been a Jan to December mandate, but was the year then we had COVID. So it was the longest mandate that any Yango focal point has had, the 2 of us. And we finished our mandate at the end of last year after COP26. So the focal points basically, again, don't have a decision-making mandate. You can't go and say, okay, this is what Yango is going to do tomorrow onwards. But your role is to be a liaison. So you liaise, you're basically the face of most of the meetings, because somebody needs to have, to such a big organization, you need to have a contact point, and that's precisely what the focal point does. You attend meetings, you build partnerships, you sort of work with the UN, you work with the different, like the UNFCCC, the different UN bodies, any other organization, any young people, sort of any sort of interest, it usually comes via the focal point. So it's sort of the main, basically like the first person who information reaches, and then that sort of goes, it's just sort of the streamlined process. And then we come to the COY, and there are different versions of the COY. This is where we are, we're at the local conference of youth. So I'm going to go backwards. So the COY was started first back in 2011, really to think about how young people can be sort of in this space. It started very organically. It started as the International Youth Climate Movement, and youth sort of came together to sort of network, to build capacity of each other before a COP happened. And then slowly this formalized into a conference of youth, which is a space that it's a conference that takes place every year before the COP will happen. So it happens a few days before COP in the city or in the country where the COP is going to be. And this is a space for young people to come together, to network, to learn from each other, to build capacity, and mainly, of course, to focus and train and build capacity on the UNFCCC. And we have an outcome that goes out of the global COY. This outcome statement has now been called the Global Youth Statement. This Global Youth Statement is built over collections. So everything that we do here at the local COY, there was the regional COY for Asia and the Pacific, but there are also other regional COYs happening. Lots of different countries are having their local COYs. All of that will be consolidated and finally will be put into a final outcome, which is the outcome of the global COY, which is the Global Youth Statement. So everything we do over the next few days is going to feed into that process, which eventually will take place at the end of October. Yes?
So what is youth statement? So I know a lot of business goes into this and goes to presidency, but is it action that at a later point of time or just goes there and it lies with the president?
It really depends, and I think we can have a longer conversation later, but it really depends because once it's, I mean, as an observer, as a young person, you can bring it in, but you need a country to champion it. So you really need to have people, which is why Yango is a space which sometimes works very effectively, is because if people who are there, if you have historic knowledge, you know which countries are open to which points. And if you have that sort of, country relation, you sort of have that relation just because you've seen each other so often, you know each other, it is easier to put your points in, sort of lobby for certain aspects. You know where they're going to be okay with, which countries, like for example, you're never going to take a human rights topic to Saudi Arabia and say, how about you bring this in? But you know which countries are going to bring in certain aspects. You know which countries are open to different negotiating items. So it is only as effective as we can lobby it to be at the end of the day. And finally, so if you're part of Yango, you happen to join, you've attended working group meetings, and you finally come to a COP or an SB, right? Next, how do you sort of be a part of either of these? Next, please, COPs or the SBs. So there are different things. Again, like the slide is not very clear, but you don't have to worry. When you go at a COP, there are Yango functions in multiple different ways. The day will begin very simply with a coordination meeting, or known as a spokes council or spokes meeting. So you'll hear spokes council, coordination very interchangeably. It's basically your morning meeting. Everyone comes together. We discuss the daily agenda. Working groups talk about what they've been working on, different sort of negotiations that they're following, where the progress has been. It's basically to coordinate activities for the day. So anything exciting that's happening in the day, people share about events that they're doing, panels that they're on, free food that you find somewhere, you know that there's a lunch reception or a dinner reception happening somewhere. It's basically a space to coordinate for the entire day. And this is where then the job then, after the coordination, moves on to the different working groups. So it is then comes down to working groups to follow different negotiations. So working groups have members who are then following the different negotiations, who've understanding what the process has been historic, like until now. What are the different sort of, which is how now the youth statement, for example, if they're very direct, correlatable aspects, working groups can bring this in and say, this is what the youth statement is saying, and this is how we want to try and bring it in. So they'll follow negotiations, they'll speak to negotiators, they'll organize bilateral meetings. Bilateral basically just when two entities come together. So, for example, government A and young people. So organize meetings with governments, or, all of those sort of behind the scenes kind of lobbying. And then, of course, there are different kinds of meetings that can happen. So there are coordination meetings with parties and groupings. So parties and countries have their own coordination meetings. Sometimes it so happens that young people who are part of Yango are also on a party batch. So they're either a negotiator, or at least they're allowed to be in the room sort of when these coordination meetings are happening. So it's very useful also to sort of have those people part of the youth constituency, because then they can understand first what the demands are, they can see how they can bring them in, but also be that sort of bridge, right, of what's really happening inside the rooms. Of course, interventions, Yango, because it's a mandated mechanism, has the space to make interventions. Basically, you have the space to speak, as simple as that. So the moment they open to observers, Yango will have a space amongst the observers to speak. And even at sort of meetings that happen in between, or like smaller government body, UN body meetings, all of these spaces, observer constituencies can send representatives, and Yango can also send representatives. Then there are different briefings, dialogues, and then after COP engagement, sometimes basically some dinner, some networking, some kind of events, all of that. In addition to that, there's also other things, and I mentioned it briefly. You can basically follow negotiations, you can plan different actions, and this is what I've not spoken about. So there are different things which is basically called an action, some sort of like a little bit of drama that you create around, like physically at the venue, right? This needs to be needs prior approval by the UN. So there are different, it's a very simple form that you need to fill in, and sort of Yango has somebody who's sort of the action coordinator at COP who you can go to if you have questions, you get the from that person. The idea is that people, if you're following the negotiations, there are certain things that you've seen are not working well enough, or you want to sort of create awareness on a certain topic, or you want to really push, you want to bring, attention to certain issues. This is where actions are very useful. There have been all kinds of innovative actions, right from a die-in where people just like pretend to be dead on the floor for a few minutes, and sort of there's a whole narration on how climate change is sort of affecting. Right from a die-in to very aggressive sort of like chantings, to skits, to creative sort of presentations, everything. As long as it's approved, sort of you need to inform them 24 hours in advance that you want to plan this, so you need to sort of do that. And actions are a very nice way to sort of, one, just change the energy at a COP, like really get people sort of known about certain things in the negotiations. And it's also a nice way because if you do it at a very strategic location, everyone's walking up and down, the negotiators are walking up and down, and this is something that people sort of can see. Then there are lots of events. There are side events that happen that you can engage in. Yango does press conferences in 2 weeks, once in week 1, once in week 2, so different working groups present what they've been doing for the 2 weeks. And then of course you can meet a whole lot of other amazing climate advocates. So this is the very simple QR code to sign up, or there's a link, and we can also send that on email, like Shrishti can send it to everyone, so that's fine. Yeah, I think that's almost the end of, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, it needs to be, I mean, anyone can do it. It needs to be approved, but yeah, anyone is free to do that.
Sorry, but we'll directly go into next presentation as of now, but we're just connecting video. So quickly, I have one thing to say. किसने किसने आज कुछ नया सीखा? Please raise your hand quickly. Quickly. Great. At least one new thing today. So that's the energy we have to get. I know it was a bit technical. I also learned new things actually. I have been following negotiations for the past 2-3 years and not very actively. Still, it was a lot of information.